payroll costs. So what costs are eligible to include? We got a few questions. One was, is health insurance includable? In fact, I think I put this in my wrong category. It wouldn't be a non-payroll cost, it'd be a payroll cost, but yes, health insurance paid for employees is includable. The only exception would be self-employed individuals, so those filing a Schedule C, and general partners aren't able to take health insurance. People asked if supplies such as personal protective equipment or things that are specifically having to be purchased as a result of COVID are includable in non-payroll. Unfortunately, no. They only gave us 3 broad categories of things to include for non-payroll. So rent, interest on a mortgage, and utilities are the 3 categories. So things that fall outside of that would not be includable, at least under the PPP program. A few people asked about car loans, vehicle loans, loans that are secured by some type of equipment or something else. Are those includable? I think the answer to that would be maybe. If you took a strict reading of the CARES Act itself, you would probably say no, because it uses the term interest on mortgage obligations. However, some people are hanging their hat on kind of a detail further into the CARES Act, where it defines a mortgage obligation to include both real and personal property. I'll give you my 2 cents, but certainly there are advisors arguing for a more aggressive position. And at the end of the day, it comes down to what the borrower, the financial institution, and the SBA are all comfortable with, and we hope there's going to be more guidance. My reading of it is mortgage is a pretty precise term with a specific meaning within the banking realm. So the fact that they used mortgage rather than secured loan tends to at least default me to thinking they intended mortgage, and they only mentioned personal property in there to include incidental property or leasehold improvements and things like that. However, you'll certainly find attorneys out there and other advisors who would say it does create a basis for including other secured loans as well. So I think something we all should watch, because that would be advantageous for sure to be able to include other equipment loans in there as well.
Rick, the hot topic question of what about software is popping up in the chat, which I know we've we've addressed, and that's one of your favorites. So I thought I'd throw that one in there too.
Yeah, good question. I wish there were a basis for including something like that. I don't personally see how you could. That you could maybe argue that it falls somehow under utilities, but I think it would be a stretch unless it's a specific type of software related to some sort of utility. And again, even with that, it probably depends on the arrangement. That when you talk utilities, they do list out specific types of utilities that are includable. And then they say, regardless of what type of utility it is, you need a service agreement in place for that utility before 2/15/20. So I would say probably not, unless it's some unusual type of software I can't think of offhand. But yeah, great.
Crash service considered a utility cost for purposes of forgiveness?
Yeah, good question here. I'm just trying to pull up so I don't misspeak here. So the utility payments that they give us are distribution of electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, and internet access are what they define as business utility payments. Again, they don't give a whole lot of information beyond that. I know there's a lot of questions of what falls into some of those categories, and with something like trash, I would have defaulted to thinking that as a utility in my mind, without looking at the PPP application and the CARES Act. That would have been something that would have defaulted in my mind to being included in there. I'm less certain as you see the categories that they specifically note there, and the fact that they don't note trash service as being part of that. So I think the short answer is I don't know. On the one silver lining though to the 24 weeks is, for anyone who does like the 24 weeks, usually it makes questions like that a little bit less important. because you get so many additional costs that it tends to be less difficult to hit full forgiveness. Still might be an issue and still great. The more we can include in there, the better. But tends to be a little bit less of an issue because you get so many additional weeks worth of expenses.
Agree. Somebody asked if you could just please repeat the list of utilities.
Oh, sure, sure. Uh, I'll say it a little bit slower. I think I rattled it off fast. So distribution of electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, internet access. I'd say of that listing, the one that we probably get the most questions when people try to make sense of it is transportation. And I'll throw out that I don't know anything more about that than anyone else, other than maybe a reminder that you still need to have a contract in place to show that service began before 2/15/20. So for those of us whose mind jumps to, what if I'm filling up vehicles or something like that on an ongoing basis at a filling station? I think the answer is that wouldn't be included because you wouldn't have had an agreement in place. However, for organizations that have some sort of fleet and maybe a fueling service agreement that was in place, to be honest, I just don't know what they intended by that. I think there may be some basis for including it if you have that contract, at least until they refine that definition a bit.
Absolutely. And I know we've talked about this too, but what about mileage reimbursement to employees as far as guidance goes on that, or what people know and don't know?
Yeah, good question. So as far as reimbursements to employees, generally that would be disqualified because you don't have a service agreement in place with the provider of the utility. So if it is for something like that, that would be considered a utility payment. If it's a reimbursement through a kind of a non-taxable reimbursement paid to employee, I generally don't see a way to include that. The only exception to that would be some organizations pay allowances, which would generally be taxable payments. So maybe they get an allowance for a cell phone, or they get some sort of housing allowance or something like that. The SBA has specifically said those are considered cash compensation and they would be includable up to that 15,385 or whatever they set it as for the 24-week period. So that might be, but just normal reimbursements of employee expenses normally wouldn't be included in the application.
Okay. Another question related to transportation came from someone who pays insurance for the employees to drive as part of their service provider relationship with their clients. If that insurance contract is in place, obviously at the start of the year and the covered period, will that qualify?
That's a great question. I actually haven't heard that one before. I think transportation is the one that seems kind of fuzziest to us about what was really intended, especially with it falling under the utility payment definition. We've actually seen some pretty interesting analysis from people of what they suspected lawmakers were intending by that. Um, and again, none of this is binding. It's just informal advisors' opinions. But some of it was thinking that, in some municipalities, there are payments that you need to make to the municipality related to transportation that are considered a utility for whatever reason. That they weren't necessarily meaning to include any type of transportation, just transportation that would fall under the definition of utility. That said, the fact that they leave so many things open-ended like this, I think leaves all of us guessing. And if they leave it open at the time somebody's trying to apply, perhaps there is a basis to the extent you have an agreement in place to include something that meets these definitions. I don't know that would be where I'd go to first. I think if you can cover it with other things that are less likely to be disallowed later, the better off you'll be. Certainly they've given us a lot of gray to play with and guess at this point. And we have heard though that they're sitting on a lot of FAQs that may address some of these questions. So again, perhaps, but I probably wouldn't count on that as my first source of eligible costs.